Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we have a fairly unsettling story, that of one Jesse Owens Clark. You will be entering the mind of a deeply disturbed man who is seemingly unaware of his own depravity. I encourage you to grab a snack, get comfortable, and brace yourself. If anyone is reading this, I would like to make it clear that this is a confession. If you are the first to read this, I would like to make it even more clear that there is currently a murderer and an arsonist on the loose, assuming this confession is found in a timely manner. That person is me. A few fun facts about myself. 1. My full name is Jesse Owens Clark. 2. I have never told a lie in my entire life. 3. I am 30 years old as of today, June the 17th, 1996. 4. I'm not the bad guy. You may be asking yourself, why would somebody purposefully hide their confession? Well, it's fairly simple, really. Certain thoughts or ideas can be toxic to the mind if they're held inside for too long. Writing this confession is simply my way of expelling those toxic thoughts. Whether or not they're witnessed by others is irrelevant. It's only important that they exist outside of my own consciousness. The events of that night were not entirely accidental. I did of course intend to cut the life of my so-called friend short, but note that this action of mine was several dominoes down the row. But enough beating around the bush. I suppose I should preface with the fact that I like burning down houses. Is this illegal? Of course, but it doesn't take a genius to observe the fact that the moral and the legal do not always coincide. Now, I don't go flinging matches into windows all willy-nilly. Of course, like I said, I'm not the bad guy. Don't worry, we'll get to him soon enough. I only burned down the eyesores. You know that lot a few streets down, the one with the caved-in roof and the weeds growing up to the gutters, assuming they're even hanging on? Yeah, I burned those. It's kind of a public service, really, but the first one was a bit more personal than the others. This was the only house I ever lit up that was in my own neighborhood, 138 Cobblewood Drive. As is typically the case with these houses, it was seriously dragging down the property value of the other homes in our respectable neighborhood. And it wasn't fair that that stupid old bitch, Dorothy Gray, got to fuck off out of her mortgage contract, leaving the rest of us to pay the price. After around, I guess 5 or 6 years of waiting around for the bank to do something with the house, I realized that the situation had become dire. The house had fallen into a state of disrepair, the lawn had grown out of control despite the town's best efforts to force the bank to maintain it, neighborhood kids had thrown rocks through the windows. It looked like absolute shit, and so I had simply driven past the house one too many times. While my wife was away visiting her mother in Pennsylvania for a week that May of '92, as she regularly did, I planned it all out. I decided I would make my move on Monday morning at 3:15 a.m. to minimize the chances of getting caught. Mind you, I live in a fairly quiet, upper-class neighborhood. We're too focused to be partying or whatever on a Sunday night, so the risk of being seen was slim to none. I decided to have some fun with the whole thing. I went to my closet to figure out what I'd wear for the occasion and decided on a black tuxedo with a red bow tie, because why the hell not? I even slicked my hair back with some gel, a look I had never had a particular liking for until that moment. I placed one bottle of charcoal lighter fluid into my briefcase, lit a cigarette, and went for a late-night stroll down to the house. I had seen a small group of teenage boys enter and exit the house a handful of times over the past few months, and was correct in my prediction that the front door would simply be unlocked. I certainly wasn't the only person in the neighborhood to see those kids on the property. They would surely be the primary suspects once the police made their rounds, no doubt. The inside of the former home was trashed. I'm sure it's fairly similar to how you're picturing it to have looked, your typical rebellious teenage vandalism. Broken mirrors, some spray-painted walls. The only room that had remained in somewhat good condition was the living room, which seemed to be their little hideout. The place reeked of marijuana, and a large pile of crushed beer cans was spilling out of the fireplace. It disgusted me. These kids were like pests, little fucking roaches that had found their way into our home thanks to one negligent resident. I sat my briefcase down on the wood kitchen table and removed the lighter fluid. Re-entering the living room, I simply unscrewed the nozzle and dumped the majority of the fluid onto the cloth couches and onto the wooden floor. I flicked what was left of my cigarette onto the floor, from which the flames only took seconds to spread to the furniture. I decided it was best to leave immediately. I closed up my briefcase and returned home. I promptly fell asleep. Needless to say, the fire had consumed the home. The fire department attempted to save the structure in vain, but demolition was immediately necessary. What I found hilarious was the ease with which I could do this. Unsurprisingly, very few people were ever upset after the ash and debris were cleared away. As with the first event, the new plot of land was ripe for construction of not just a house, but a home. New families moved in, built brand new houses, and raised the overall value of the neighborhoods they were in. Very little was lost to the public and much was gained. In my opinion, the banks and the other lenders had their chance to attempt a resale of the house. If they hadn't been able to make it happen in a timely fashion, or at least maintain the damn thing, then in my eyes, they'd lost their chance. I began to light up houses several miles away in completely different towns. I figured this was safer, less chance of being recognized. Besides, our neighborhood doesn't have those ghost houses. I live in a respectable neighborhood full of respectable people doing respectable things with their lives. Ms. Gray was the outlier, needless to say. Every neighborhood has their outliers. And so, this became my goal, to rid other towns of similar tumors. I found many of these houses out west in the Buffalo, New York area, some 40, 50, even 60 miles away. Now, as you may recall, I had a wife at the time, and due to the integrity and decency of our relationship, she was rightfully curious as to the nature of these excursions. Although it pained me very much, I was forced to conjure up a little white fabrication in order to preserve the continuation of my services. That fabrication was Henry. Henry was not so much a man as he was an idea, a prop. Henry, supposedly, was one of my high school friends with whom I had supposedly grown closer to over the past several months through the use of electronic mail. Supposedly, Henry had recently been in a terrible car accident near his supposed home of Buffalo, New York, and supposedly, he had asked me to visit him while he was recovering. Of course, me being me, how could I have turned a blind eye to this request? I informed Jan, my wife, that I would regularly be making trips to visit Henry for the foreseeable future. She appeared to be surprisingly open to the suggestion, even a bit enthusiastic about it, which I found a bit strange. I didn't feel that I had the luxury to pry deeper into this premonition, which I initially attributed to the trusting nature of our relationship. I later learned that there were other reasons for her openness, certain assumptions that were made on her behalf which I was unaware of. Regardless, things went on this way for years. I could visit my good friend Henry in Buffalo perhaps once a month for the weekend, conduct my neighborhood pruning without many bumps in the road, and return home. There was a certain professionalism to the routine which I grew a liking to. "Honey, I believe I'll be visiting Henry this weekend," I would begin, for example. "Okay, that sounds good, dear. Just overnight as usual?" "Yes, I'll be gone for the usual amount of time." "Perfect. I'll mark it down on the kitchen calendar." I'd usually spice it up a little bit for good measure. "We're going to watch the Buffalo Bills game." "That should be fun, Jesse." Clearly, she had no reason to question the existence of Henry. I had conditioned her for many years with my honesty. That isn't to say that Henry was an interruption in that honesty. At least, not on my end of the relationship. Fast forward to December of last year, that's 1995. Not that you didn't know this already, I'm sure you'll cross-examine that fact as well as the others. Jan, myself, and a coworker friend of mine named Peter were having dinner at Park 34, which you're surely familiar with if you're from the area. Mind you, Peter wasn't the type to get married. His relationship philosophy was a bit liberal, you could say. An important note, Peter is the bad guy. Although I personally found this to be rather unflattering of an emerging professional, I also, as you surely have already gathered, embrace all kinds of lifestyles. Although I would certainly not adopt it myself, I am mostly accepting towards the decisions of my associates. An important key word from the previous phrase, mostly. In one of the most baffling moves of disrespect, I took note of the subtle yet undeniable position of Peter's hand. Under the table, clearly, his hand rested directly on my wife's outer thigh. Initially, me being me, I accepted this as a simple sign of comfort between our two parties. Swiftly, it became clear that this was rather a sign of a lack of exclusivity between the two aforementioned parties. Although I was rightfully disturbed by the events taking place before me, I happened to have a very strong sense of control over my mind and body, and therefore was able to keep my normally hyper-emotional thoughts at bay. I continued to speak exactly as I had before the issue had come to my attention, simply to see how the night would play out. Regrettably, I slowly began to feel a strange disconnect between the two, as though I was the solo party, the third wheel. They entered into their own conversation full of laughter and the like for several minutes before they made the realization that I hadn't spoken in some time. They then both proceeded to make overly desperate attempts to reconcile this imbalance by asking me relevant questions. Now, to be clear, I was not angered with my wife. Due to her good nature, I immediately understood that she had been coerced into the snares of Peter through no fault of her own. Predictably as any man would, I desired to dissolve this imbalance and return our relationship to stasis. A clarification. I desired to return my marital relationship to a stasis. My platonic relationship with Peter simply could not be allowed to continue. And yes, this was all the evidence I needed of the affair. A question you may wish to ask. How could such a subtle sign be enough to prove the existence of a full-blown affair? Well, if you haven't picked up on this already, my mind is fine-tuned to the inner workings of the human consciousness. I pick up on social cues, and I see them for what they are. Besides, this conversation will prove redundant in a few moments. Let's move on. I kept my emotions at bay for the rest of our outing. I said nothing of my observations, not to Peter, not even to my wife. I kept them suppressed until she retired for the night. It was then that I began to draft my plan to return balance to the relationship and to free my wife from Peter's sexual and emotional distortions of reality. At dinner earlier in the night, Peter announced a piece of information which would later prove useful. Malcolm's hosting a New Year's party at his penthouse next Monday night at 7. You two can come as my +1s, even though you're more of a 10, Jan. This tragically unamusing remark, which I can only assume was not intended to arouse a comedic response out of either of us, garnered an agonizing amount of laughter from my wife. Regardless, this event would prove very useful. Darn, I've already made plans for New Year's, Jan announced, visibly disappointed. Honey, maybe you can go. Quick on my feet, I turned to Peter with a smile. I'll be there. Before you, as usual. He turned to my wife with a predictable snicker. Yeah, sure, bud. And she laughed! She laughed at her own husband's expense. Obviously, I kept my cool, mostly because that initial remark was intended to evoke a response. Again, I see things for what they are, and I see people for how they really work. I have a track record of arriving to events, to work, to any occasion, perfectly on time, on the dot, not a minute late. I believe that regular punctuality is a very strong indication of one's consistent work ethic and overall self-discipline. However, I am rarely early to said events. I, for one, believe that is a rude practice. Peter does not hold the same philosophy. Peter also happens to be somewhat arrogant. This, combined with his newfound primal desire to appear superior to me in the eyes of my wife, means he will surely arrive excessively early to Malcolm's party. I was certain that he would also make a point to notify me of his arrival. With this fact in mind, I drafted up a fairly simple sequence of events which I would carry out on New Year's Eve. Let's skip ahead. It is now the night of December 31st, 6:34 p.m. Parked 2 blocks away from Peter's house, wearing my signature attire. Predictably, my pager goes off. As usual, is all it says. Again, the party was to begin at 7 o'clock. Now, Malcolm's apartment was downtown, so I knew Peter was several miles away. I left the car where it was and walked the rest of the way to Peter's home. A vital piece of information. Several months prior to all this, Peter, during a particular outing in which I had chosen to retain my sobriety, had come to me in a state of anxious intoxication, pleading with me to drive to his house and to feed his darling Pomeranians. He gave me his garage code, 3024. Door within is never locked. Naturally, I wrote this down in a notepad and kept it for future reference. Knowledge is power. He hadn't forgotten to feed the dogs anyway. Both bowls were full. Back to the night of December 31st, 6:39 p.m. I enter the house with only a few simple objectives. First, I had to shut those little fuckers up. I got them into their cage and flung the blanket over the sides. Next, I removed the batteries from the smoke detectors. Luckily, his home's fire prevention system was fairly primitive, and none of the detectors had been hardwired into any sort of security system like they were in my home. I pulled a chair from his dining room set, removed the batteries, and mounted them back onto the ceiling. Next, equipped with a nail gun, I sealed each of the upstairs windows and unlocked an unassuming window from the utility room for a quiet entrance later that night. I then released the Pomeranians and replaced the blanket exactly how it had been, lining the blanket up as it had appeared in my nearly photographic memory. I almost left the house before searching for fire extinguishers, a near-fatal mistake, as I found the home's sole canister sitting in Peter's bedroom. I ended up arriving at Malcolm's apartment 16 minutes late. This was personally irritating, but necessary. Several minutes after my arrival, I decided that the issue of Peter would be rectified the following night. This was convenient, as Jan was also planning on leaving to visit her mother in Pennsylvania around noon the following day as well. For tonight, I decided to allow myself to loosen up, as is required from time to time to preserve mental stability and efficiency. And so the night flew by. The following day dragged on with painful anticipation. I tried to read, solve crossword puzzles. In my desperation, I even attempted to watch television, but the emptiness of it made time appear to pass even slower. Jan left for Pennsylvania, and eventually I was alone again. I dressed back up in the tuxedo, slicked my hair back, placed a container of lighter fluid into a briefcase, among other items which may have come in handy. For this particular occasion, I thought it best to wear a pair of black, disposable gloves. I knew that given the unique nature of that night's events, there was certain to be a fair amount of investigation afterwards. And so, punctual as usual, just as planned at 3:15 a.m., I exited my car from the same location I had parked it at the previous night, entered the rear of Peter's house, and slid open the unlocked utility room window. Reluctantly, I removed my shoes and placed them into my briefcase. I would have to sacrifice style for practicality. They would make too much noise for this particular occasion. I almost turned around to slide the window closed again. Then, suddenly, a realization. In roughly 30 minutes, there would be no window. I left it open. Entering the hallway, I headed for the stairs. No, I wasn't planning on going upstairs. That was too risky. I'd probably wake the man up. Instead, the stairs would become my target. Because the upstairs windows were nailed shut from the previous night, the stairs became the only method of escape. And so, it was important that they would be the first section to burn. I carefully walked against the wall, the least likely area of the floor to creak, and eventually got to the stairs. I quietly placed my briefcase on the rug and pulled out the lighter fluid, as well as a pack of matches. I took my time, carefully making my way just a few steps from the top until I could spill the fluid down onto the hallway above. I then walked backwards, spilling the tasty stuff all the way down to the bottom step. Every last drop. Suddenly, a noise. Bed springs. Had I been too loud? Impossible. I had been completely silent, surprisingly silent, even for myself. Before I could even process my next move, Peter arrived at the top of the stairway with a metal baseball bat. "Who the fuck are you? What are you doing in my house?" Still, I was frozen at the bottom of the stairs. Surprised that he still didn't recognize me, I questioned possibly making a break for it. Only an instant later, Peter tried to bolt down the stairs. A reminder. The stairs were coated in lighter fluid. Obviously, Peter was unaware of this fact, causing him to tumble halfway down the stairs. He caught himself about 5 steps from the bottom. I decided I only had one good option. Surely he would recognize me come morning time, and I'd be thrown in some crazy mental asylum. I tried to light the match. I finally got the match to light, and I tossed the match at the stairs, but it fizzled out before it hit. You'd think it would still be hot enough to ignite, but you'd be incorrect. He looked up. "Jess? What are you doing here? How'd you..." I looked up at him as I held the match a foot above the bottom step. "Hey Pete, how's it going?" And then, I simply let it go. Within an instant, the entire flight of stairs was engulfed in flames. Of course, Peter was screaming and rolling around. Sadly, it quickly became evident that the flames weren't going to take him out. So while he was screaming and rolling around at the bottom of the stairs like a little kid about to get his flu shot, I pulled out... Well, I wasn't sure I was going to confess to this part, but I actually brought an old revolver with me, and I almost blew Peter's fucking brains out, right up until I heard a second whisper come from the top of the stairs. "Jesse?" With the gun still pointed at Ghost Rider, I slowly turned my head towards the top of the stairs, and through the flames, it was Jan. My wife Jan, in this motherfucker's house. Honey, what? Now, I'm not usually lost for words, but if you've ever found yourself in a situation like that, you probably would be too. She stood there, wrapped in a blanket like an innocent little child. "I thought you were at your mother's, babe." And that's when it all clicked, including the revolver, of course, but more importantly, it clicked in my own head that this was all Henry's fault. She, of course, screamed and ran away from the top of the stairs. I simply packed up my briefcase and left. I promptly fell asleep in bed after arriving home. It was late morning when I awoke to the sound of my doorbell. After grabbing my rope and answering the front door downstairs, I was greeted by 2 police officers. One tall, skinny, bald one with red hair, and next to him, a short, fat one with a funny-looking right ear. The tall one spoke. "Good morning, sir. Would you happen to be Mr. Evans?" I answered with a yes, although, as you'll recall, my full name is Jesse Owens Clark. My wife decided to keep her maiden name upon our marriage. "May we come inside? We're here to deliver some bad news." Although I fought the urge to just close the door and go back to bed, I didn't want to arouse any unnecessary suspicion. I stepped aside and allowed them entry. The tall one asked, "May we sit?" Sure. "What's all this about?" I asked, hoping to speed this up. The 2 officers sat on the love seat. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I realized the briefcase sat on the nightstand directly next to the short one. I had neglected to empty its contents before going to bed. "Well," the tall one began. The room seemed to freeze over. There was a solid 3 seconds of silence. "Your wife, Janet Evans, was killed early this morning in a house fire." It was precisely at that moment that I realized that the shorter officer had a little spot on his pants, just above his ankle. I just kind of stared at it with my arms folded. No words were spoken for about 15 seconds. I almost felt embarrassed for the guy, walking around with such an obvious spot on his pants. I wondered if he knew it was even there, or if he did, and simply didn't have enough self-respect to get his uniform cleaned. "Your friend, Peter Hall, was also killed in the same home early this morning as a result of the fire, as well as an apparent gunshot wound to the chest." I swallowed hard. I couldn't believe Peter had pushed me into this situation. What a selfish prick! I simply buried my face in my hands. I've never cried before in my life, and I couldn't see this being any different, so I simply sat there in silence. We sat like that for around 2 minutes. The two men didn't say a word. It was beginning to become awkward. They had delivered their message. What else was left to do? Comfort me? I didn't need comfort. I needed to get back to bed. "Mr. Evans, although we sympathize with you during this difficult time, we ask that you come back to the station with us so we can get a clearer picture as to what happened." Immediately, I could see where this was going. I questioned whether or not I should ask if I was being detained. I wasn't sure that I was, but I didn't want to arouse any suspicion while in questioning, and have the police search my house under a warrant. In my fatigue, I had neglected to dispose of any evidence. The briefcase, the revolver, the 13 bottles of lighter fluid sitting in my basement, sadly, even the tuxedo, especially the dress shoes. It all needed to be disposed of before I did any talking. Per usual, I was quick on my feet. "Of course," I said, removing my face from my hands. "I'd love to do whatever I can to help. Would you mind if I just met you two outside in a minute?" I said, gesturing to my robe. "I'd like to get dressed." "Yes, whatever you need, Mr. Evans," the tall officer began. "Take your time, and we can give you a ride in the squad car." "If it's all the same, officer, I'd prefer to drive myself," I responded. Riding in the back of a police car was reserved for people who were going to jail. I, myself, was not going to be one of those people. "Whatever makes you most comfortable. Just follow us when you pull out. We'll wait on the curb." And with that, they closed the door and walked across the front lawn instead of down the driveway. This, although annoying, was the least of my worries at the moment. I had to act fast. I grabbed the briefcase which contained the revolver and went upstairs. I then put the nail gun inside, as well as the tuxedo and the shoes. I then quickly changed into a pair of khaki shorts and a black t-shirt, and quickly went down the 2 flights of stairs into the basement. Pulling an old wooden ladder from the storage closet, I hid the briefcase as well as 13 bottles of lighter fluid above one of the drop ceiling tiles, being careful to set it back exactly how it had been before. I put the ladder back and used a broom to spread out the dust that had fallen from the ceiling tile onto the floor. "Do you want anything to drink, Jesse? We got coffee, water, Coke, whatever you want." I was now in a small room, sitting at a table with a different cop than either of the two who had brought me in. This one was dressed in a white button-down shirt, no tie. "I'll take a coffee, actually, that'd be nice. Just a dash of milk is all I take it with." "Sure. Only skim or almond. No creamer, not even 2%. If you don't have either of those, I'll just take it black." He nodded. "You got it," he said, closing the door behind him. I pondered what they were really trying to figure out for me and what else they might already have, but nothing came to me. My mind went blank. The man was back within a minute with my coffee and a cup for himself. "I can get you something to eat too if you want. I know you probably haven't had anything all day today." I almost did ask for something, but honestly, the good cop routine was boring me. "That's all right," I said, warming my hands around the cup. The room was much too cold. "Just let me know," he said, sitting down. "I'm Detective Reed with the Rochester Police Department. First things first, I'm sorry to hear about the loss of your wife and your friend Peter. You're very strong for holding yourself together and coming in today to help us figure out what happened to those two." I couldn't believe Peter had made me shoot him. Why the hell did he have to push me to that point? If it hadn't been for the gunshot wound, I bet the whole thing would have been taken down as just a terrible accident. The detective continued. "There is strong evidence of foul play in last night's events, even with the little information we've gathered in the past few hours since the events took place." "Such as?" I asked. "Such as Peter's bullet wound, as well as the evidence of the use of some form of kerosene accelerant on his body, as well as in the foyer of the home. In other words, this tragedy was almost certainly a homicide." I stared at the black marks left by the table rubbing against the light gray walls of the room. Still, no words came to mind. I'm sorry if this is a sensitive question, Jesse, but were you aware that your wife was at Mr. Hall's residence last night? I pondered my response to this. Allow me to remind you, I don't lie. She hadn't discussed it with me. The cop fidgeted in his seat. I see. He scribbled that down on his notepad. Do you have any idea why she would have been... I think it's pretty clear, I said with my eyes closed, hands still sucking the heat out of the paper cup. The room went silent, followed by more scribbles from the detective. And where were you last night, Jesse? And that was my cue. First, a deliberate 3-second pause. I then locked our eyes together. What are you trying to imply, detective? I'm not implying anything, Jesse. We're just trying to gather as much... Do you have even a shred of understanding of the fire raging inside of me right now? My wife is dead, Mr. Reed. And just like you, I'm also trying to gather and process information. I don't think you're trying to work with me at all. What kind of a question is that? Right out of the gate? This is all just standard procedure. Bullshit! Do I need to call my lawyer, or am I free to fuck off out of this place? You're free to leave at any time, Mr. Evans. It's Clark! Evans was my wife's maiden name. I stood up and opened the door. Thanks for the coffee, I said, dropping it into the trash. Now, was that a bit coarse of me? Sure, but don't be so quick to assume that it was anything but calculated. I'd done my research on the do's and don'ts of police interrogations, and it seems that an outburst is more likely of an innocent person than a guilty one. I could have sat there and tried to explain myself or come up with some BS alibi, but I decided to save that for my attorney. I drove home in a cold sweat, trying to figure out what I would do if they were searching my home, but luckily nobody was there. I left the car running in the driveway and briskly walked inside, ran to the basement, grabbed the evidence from the drop ceiling, bagged it up in a plastic leaf bag from the basement, and threw it in the trunk of the car. An old friend of mine who I hadn't talked to in years owns a demolition business, and along with it, this massive landfill. It's a 15-minute drive from my house, keeping with traffic. Not particularly in the mood to get pulled over, I got there in 20. When I got to the gate, I shut the car off, lit a much-needed cigarette, and walked about 10 minutes deep into the dump. Until I arrived at a pile of trash and rubble that looked like it came from a cleared-out hardware store. Good enough. I tore open the trash bag and dumped everything onto the ground. After gathering some sticks from a nearby patch of pine trees and throwing those into the pile as well, I soaked the tuxedo, shoes, nail gun, and what the hell, even the revolver, everything in 2 bottles of lighter fluid. I flicked the cigarette into the pile and it immediately kicked back a huge burst of heat onto my face. I squatted in front of the fire and contemplated everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. I knew that I'd be able to keep my name clear, and I was right, they would never pin anything on me. More so, sitting in front of that fire, I felt... something. I'm not sure exactly what it was that I felt. I'd been depraved of emotion through my entire life, and I suppose my lack of emotional experience inhibited my ability to assess what I was feeling through comparison. I struggled with myself in that moment. I struggled to understand myself. Maybe I am the bad guy. I don't know. And I don't care anymore. I no longer believe that it matters. Life and emotion and love and loss, it's all without greater meaning. Despite the efforts of religion or spirituality or mythology, we're all primal, self-obsessed monsters. If you were in my shoes, if you found yourself with my circumstances, you would do the same. You would be capable of nothing less, in fact. You are a product of predetermined conditions, and therefore it is not up to you whether you are the good guy or the bad guy. Your will is a delusion. I'm not sure what emotion I felt that day, although what I felt was almost certainly a negative emotion. It still felt good to feel.